deconstructed the effects of social emotional learning and teacher relationships on middle school student well-being by Beggs and Olson. I picked this one because not only did it relate to my practice, but it had some pretty clear strengths and weaknesses that I really took a lot away from. So the abstract, no, technically not part of chapter 1, but this is actually where we get information on the population for the first time. So we know we have 10 middle school students in 7th and 8th grade. The study took place over a period of 4 months. 3 of those were affected by COVID-19 closures. So we get that really important information there. We do not get such information, however, from the introduction or from anywhere in chapter 1. Chapter 1 was definitely the biggest weak spot. From what I've come to know about action research, I really expected this chapter to have a lot of active voice, first person, and giving me this like juice, the personal information about the researchers, the students, their school, the issues at hand, and why they chose this topic. It doesn't really do that. So this really felt more like traditional research. Is it a very passive voice? We have a lot of statements like educators and parents want, students need, schools and teachers can, right? So that third person passive language. They give us a nice introduction here, kind of a thesis statement. We get a background of SEL. We get the demographics impacted. However, we don't get the demographics of the school that they're at, of the students that are involved in the research, and why they chose SEL for their specific students, other than the fact that they find social emotional learning important in general, which they clearly do. We get a lot of that information. They do give us a little bit of kind of relevant local information here. We have, this Every Student Succeeds Act that they talk about. They give us information from the Minnesota Department of Education, discussion of school systems in Minnesota and how SEL is perceived there. We get the Safe and Supportive Minnesota Schools Act. So we do get stuff like that, but we, again, don't get any information about their school, their community, their demographics, anything of that nature. We do get here, they mention confounding factors. So they're studying social emotional competency of these students and SEL skills. And they do touch on the fact that this can be compounded by socioeconomic factors, cultural and language diversity, technology, interactions, disabilities, varying abilities. And they do mention that these things can actually all be addressed by social emotional learning skills and interventions. So they do cover that base there that they address. They mention that the study does focus, this is the closest we get here, that it focuses on students that are displaying low social emotional well-being and academic struggles. That's who they're looking for. But we really don't get any more specific than that. They don't mention this being an issue at their school or anything about the students that they chose. So the problem statement comes next, and this is where I thought I would find that information. I was like, okay, well, here's the problem statement. Here it comes. But no. So the problem statement is really just a recap of the introduction and a summary. That's basically it. Just a summary of that introduction and why social emotional learning is important. Still very passive voice. Theoretical framework, pretty strong. They really set the ground for the 5 competencies. Castle's framework pops up all throughout this paper, and they set the tone for that. This is mostly what's in here. They mention Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, and they weave that in. But really, by the end of that chapter, that's it. There's nothing, and there's no definition of terms. And the entire thing's in passive voice. So now we get to the review of the literature. This is where their strength comes out. The review is very strong. The review of the literature, they give a foundation and for every single bit of methodology that they use, their data analysis, the reasoning for looking into social emotional learning and its importance. This is all supported here. Support for every single aspect of the study in the lit review. They covered every base left no stone unturned, and I really took a lot away from that. They have a really nice setup here in the beginning of each section, in the beginning of the lit review. They set us up properly for what we're about to get into more detail. And right here at the beginning, these references to Yoder are very strong. Yoder comes up throughout the study. And they're kind of just setting up the importance of all of these things we're going to see, the 5 skill sets, the importance of SEL. And then they pop in this reference here with Pianta et al., who is not referenced a whole lot, but has to do with this positive student-teacher relationship aspect that they address in their study. Now, while Chapter 1 didn't have definition of terms, they do include these tables throughout the lit review, which kind of serve that purpose. So again, here we've got CASTLE. They're setting up CASTLE's kind of overall view, which is really important since he shows up throughout the study. They're setting this up also with Zins et al., and they're tying them both in. Both of these are like sources that they rely on heavily. And again, we're getting the 5 competencies, which they discussed in the theoretical framework, but we're getting this in more detail. The academic success section here, I felt like could easily be one of those things that sort of derailed and felt isolated, but they did a great job of weaving in sources that they're like they've got Zins et al. And CASTLE I mentioned before. They made sure to include them here in this section so that it wouldn't be its standalone thing. It really ties into the rest of it. They also have, they mentioned neuroimaging, the amygdala, which of course I think is always important when we're talking about educational research. Good to have that, at least even this quick little reference in there. I thought this was kind of weird. They mentioned absenteeism here and the issues with it and how the accuracy with reporting. And I really just felt like they should have just left absenteeism and this whole thing just out of the study altogether. I didn't really find it that important, especially if it's going to be hard to get accurate reporting with it. So that was kind of weird to me. Then we really get to supporting all of their methodology. We've got the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, which they give all the support for, Jenkins et al. We get the student-instructor relationship scale from Creasy that they use. Teacher praise they set up, which they talk about a lot. The Move This World SEL program is also used in their methodology. Here they address struggles, limitations, and holes. They really cover their bases with this one. I think they mention everything that they need to, but the thing that really stood out is that CASTLE warns, according to them, that if programs are implemented poorly, they can harm students. That seemed like huge to me. I read that and I was like, what? And they did address that they had to train. They made sure everybody was trained in this. But I think this is so huge that they really should have addressed it more because, I mean, guys, if they don't do this correctly, they can harm students. Isn't harming students one of those big red flags when we're doing research, especially with minors, right? And I really felt like they should have expanded on that a little bit more when they talked about the training and their methodology. They mention the limitation of the ability to measure social emotional competencies accurately. They reference McCown here who talks about this, but they do kind of address that by using the methodologies that they and the data analysis that they reference later, and by using these kind of really these research-based methods. The research is collaborative, reflective. They use SEL support practices, positive relationships, praise, an SEL curriculum, class activities, discussions, and one-on-one advisory work to develop relationships. They also collect artifacts, observational data, and inquiry data. Most of their data, especially the qualitative data, is going to come from student surveys. Actually, both are really coming from most of it from student surveys, the ones that were mentioned in the lit review. So here we get the population. So 7th and 8th grade students in a small town in Minnesota, with focus groups of 5 7th and 5 8th graders. First, I was a bit confused about how many focus groups. Turns out they have here about 115 students total, 5 of whom are in the focus groups of 7th graders, 5 are as 8th graders, and 5 males, 5 females. total of 10 in the focus group. So they narrowed these down using these surveys, using the Move This World. They did school-wide. So they had already been doing this before this study and identified students of higher need, and then narrowed that down with more assessments to identify the students of highest need. And those were the ones in the focus group. A lot of the students were self-reported data. So they used Move This World, SIRS, Minnesota Student Survey, and SDQ for their methodology. For qualitative data analysis, they use a 5-phase cycle by Hendricks, who they also used for the quant data. Includes compiling, disassembling, reassembling, interpreting, and concluding. This came from self-reported surveys and in text form. And then they coded the data, reassembled it into categories, and then drew conclusions from there for the data analysis. That for both, and they showed a positive correlation between SEL and student-teacher relationships in relation to student well-being and academic success. For the quantitative data, they used a 5-step process of organizing and analyzing, also by Hendricks, including gathering data, graphical displays, examining display data, sharing the analyses, and documenting connections. They also use gradebook and attendance data reports provided by the school. That's the gist of the methodology. Still could not get it down to 10 minutes or below. I am so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me, but that's my deconstruction.